I recently came across new information that throws fresh light on the death of one of the Titanic's able-bodied sailors, of whom there were very few. They rapidly ran out on the night and had to put firemen and even cooks at the oars because there were so few of these ABs, as they're called, able-bodied sailors. Well, one of them was a young man aged 25, be called William Henry Lyons, Lyons, from Cork, very close to Queenstown, a few miles away from the last port of call. He was from Cork in Ireland, and he went aboard as an able-bodied seaman. And when the ship went down, he was forced to dive and then to swim, and he was pulled aboard lifeboat 4. But unfortunately, his brief exposure in the bone-chilling water of the North Atlantic that night had been enough to cause hypothermia, and he was to be found dead in lifeboat 4 when it managed to row towards the rescuing ship, the Cunarder Carpathia. And Thomas Patrick Dillon, who was a fireman, a trimmer aboard the RMS Titanic, and who was saved and who lived in lifeboat 4, said he awoke and found 2 men dead lying on top of him, and one of those was W.H. Lyons. But the story of William Lyons takes a new turn for me because I recently discovered, nearly 21 years after the sinking, an account of how Lyons had died, his last moments, and a story about him on the Titanic. When I acquired some magazines connected to Joseph George Scarrett, who was a fellow able-bodied seaman aboard the Titanic and who actually saw the iceberg gliding past post-impact, and who described that scene such that he was represented in a famous pictorial spread in a British illustrated newspaper called the Illustrated London News. And we see a picture of Scarrett looking back on this ghostly berg as it slides further aft. And Scarrett says in a magazine called the Peer Review, it was a house magazine for British peers jutting out into the sea around the coast of the United Kingdom, and for people who worked on piers. And Scarrett gave an interview, and he described a fellow seaman that he remembered as Paddy Lynch. He didn't quite get the name right. The surname was Lyons, but he calls him Lynch. There's no Lynch on board the Titanic crew manifest, so it must be Lyons he's talking about. And of course, Paddy isn't quite William Henry, but then lots of Irishmen on board were simply called Paddy to their mates, in the same way as Scots crew members were called Jock. We know about Jock Hume, obviously. His name was John Hume, the violinist. And Welshmen would be known as Taffy. So any Irishman was prone to be called Paddy. As we know that George McGough, for instance, who was born in Wexford, Ireland, he was called Paddy McGough. And by the same token, William Lyons would have been known as Paddy Lyons because he was Irish. And when Joseph Scarrett remembers this name, the best he can do is call him Paddy Lynch, because he knows it's L-Y, some such. And he constructs this man, Paddy Lynch. He's writing in this magazine in the 1930s, 1933. And he describes how the story of how Lyons was in the port watch, and therefore he was on duty from 4 p.m. to 8 a.m. and from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. each day. And when Lyons came off duty on the night of the sinking, he threw his sea boots down the spiral staircase to beat him down there so that he could pick them up later and bring them to his bunk. And when he got down, one of his mates had played a prank and taken one of those boots. And there was lots of cursing, as you can imagine, by Lyons as he searched around for a second boot that one of his mates had secreted. And Scarrett tells how, strange to relate, that when he saw the body being brought aboard of William Henry Lyons, when it was retrieved and brought on board the Carpathia, he only had one boot on. So when the alarm went off, and later on that night around midnight, it seems that Paddy Lyons had been unable to find his second boot and had put one on, or maybe he had both them on and one came off, I don't know. But Joseph Scarrett also said he had a nasty wound in his throat. And it makes you wonder about the horror, the desperation and the panic of those times. There's another account by a crew survivor named Thomas Jones, who was in charge of lifeboat number 8, which left from the port side fairly early in proceedings. And Mr. Jones tells of how Sailor Lyons was involved in lowering one end of the lifeboat. He was paying out the falls on either the bow or the stern of the boat as it went down. He doesn't specify which, but so there's a small piece of heroism, if you like, by Lyons in helping to pay out the rope that is lowering this small consignment of men, women and children in their escape craft to the sea. And then the boat pulls away, and later on we have Thomas Jones describing how Sailor Lyons, back on the ship, the sinking Titanic, is amongst those shouting for the partially filled lifeboats to come back, which is an effort initiated by Captain Smith, calling back some of the less than full lifeboats to come back and take more people off. And Jones describes hearing "boat ahoy, boat ahoy" being shouted in the Irish brogue of his friend. He can discern the voice of Paddy Lyons, also known as William Henry Lyons, nicknamed Paddy, shouting plaintively amongst the rest, amongst that vast congregation, effectively on the Titanic, begging for aid and salvation. And I'm struck by that idea that he could discern one voice amongst the multitude there, how it seems to encapsulate one person's loneliness amongst the many. You know, there's a famous Jewish phrase, "save one life, save one life." And everything comes down to the individual, because they are all desperate individuals trying to have one last chance of life by a ship coming back or a lifeboat coming back and maybe plucking them from the predicament in which they find themselves. So it's by getting these small fragments of the jigsaw from various accounts, maybe separated by a space of years, we can piece together and get some small glimpse of individual lives as the Titanic went down. And that's partly what prods me on in my research, because it's always a revelation to find some new piece of mosaic that will slot in somewhere and be cross-referenced and corroborated somewhere else, and we can build up a closer picture to what actually happened that night. Because of one thing I am sure, and that is that the full picture has not been told, and it needs constant research to try and get as near as possible to the truth of this amazing event that happened over a century ago on the lonely North Atlantic.